Hello, my friends. I am so glad you are here today. Take a slow breath and make yourself comfortable. Let this story begin. Picture a small room in London, somewhere in the year 1899. The walls are thin, and the cold creeps through the cracks like an unwelcome guest. In this cramped space above a bakery, a young boy is watching his mother. She is singing to a small audience in a cheap music hall, her voice beautiful but fragile, breaking every few moments. And then something terrible happens. Her voice stops completely. The audience begins to laugh, then shout, then throw things at her. The little boy watches from backstage, his heart breaking, his small fists clenched in anger and shame. Think about that for a moment. This is the moment that would shape one of the most famous people who ever lived. This is the story of Charlie Chaplin, a man who became the most recognizable figure in the history of cinema. But his story did not begin with fame. It began in poverty, in hunger, in a world that seemed to offer him nothing but struggle. Charlie Chaplin was born on April 16, 1889, in Walworth, South London. His mother, Hannah Chaplin, was a singer, though her voice was never strong. His father, Charles Chaplin Setter, was also in entertainment. But he was a heavy drinker who left the family when Charlie was very young. Within a few years, his father would be dead, and his mother would be struggling to feed her two sons on her own. A single mother with two children in Victorian London, with no money and no help, was facing an almost impossible situation. The poverty around them was not abstract. It was everywhere. It was in the food they did not have, in the clothes that did not fit, in the cold that crept into their bones at night. The young Charlie and his half-brother Sidney learned early what it meant to be hungry. They went days without proper meals. They slept in workhouses, places where the poor were sent to live and work in exchange for shelter. A workhouse was a building designed for people who had nowhere else to go, and it was not a kind place. The food was minimal, the rules were strict, and the people inside were treated as less than human by a society that believed poverty was a moral failure rather than a circumstance of birth. Picture two small boys sharing a narrow bed in a cold dormitory. Can you imagine that? But the world was not finished with him. When Charlie was 8 years old, he was sent to an orphanage, a place where children without parents could live and receive basic education. The orphanage was not cruel exactly, but it was rigid, cold, and deeply impersonal. Children there wore uniforms, followed strict schedules, and learned very little that would help them survive in the world outside. For a sensitive boy with a wild imagination, this experience was both traumatic and strangely formative. He learned what it meant to be controlled, to be invisible, to have no voice. And perhaps he also learned, somewhere in that gray environment, that he could make people laugh. Because even in the orphanage, even in the most joyless places, he discovered that when he made a face or told a joke, something changed. The other children's faces would light up. The adults would pause. Laughter was power, even in a place designed to crush it. By the age of 10, Charlie was working as a child laborer in conditions that would horrify us today. He performed on stage in a troupe called the 8 Lancashire Lads, dancing and entertaining audiences in cheap theatres across England. The hours were long, the pay was little, and the world of entertainment was filled with people who saw children as cheap labor to be used and discarded. But something was happening to this boy that no one could see yet. He was learning, watching, absorbing every technique, every gesture, every way of holding an audience's attention. He was becoming, without knowing it, a master of his craft. Think about that for a moment. While other children were in school, learning subjects they would forget, this boy was learning the human soul. He was learning what made people cry, What made them laugh? What made them lean forward in their seats and forget their own lives for a moment? This knowledge would stay with him forever. By his teenage years, Charlie had joined a theater company called the Fred Karno Company, a troupe that performed comic sketches, short funny plays with exaggerated characters and physical humor. Here, his talent began to bloom. He learned to control his body like an instrument, to make a walk funny, to make silence speak louder than words. And then something extraordinary occurred. In 1910, the Karno Company traveled to the United States on a tour. Charlie was 21 years old. He stepped off a ship in New York City, and the world that had been small suddenly became vast. America in 1910 was a place of enormous energy, of new money and old prejudice, of factories and theaters and millions of people arriving from every corner of the world with nothing but hope in their pockets. This was the country that would become the center of cinema. It was in America, where Charlie Chaplin was discovered by a man named Mack Sennett, who ran a film studio called Keystone Studios. Sennett offered Charlie a contract at $150 a week, which was an enormous sum for a young man who had grown up in poverty. Charlie Chaplin signed on the dotted line, and in February 1913, he arrived in Hollywood, California, with nothing but a suitcase and an ocean of ambition. He was 24 years old, and he had no idea that his face would one day be known worldwide. But his early films were not immediately successful. The studio wanted him to move fast, to make film after film, to be funny without being too refined. They treated him like a machine. Charlie hated it. He was an artist, and he wanted control. And then, in 1914, he created a character that would change everything. The character was called the Tramp. He was a small man with baggy pants, a tight jacket, a bowler hat, and a cane. He walked with a unique waddle, his shoes turned outward, his posture both confident and vulnerable. He had a toothbrush mustache, slightly too big for his thin face, and eyes that could hold infinite sadness beneath a comic exterior. The Tramp was not just a funny character. He was a human being, someone who wanted love, who faced cruelty, who refused to surrender even when the world crushed him. He was the boy from the orphanage, the hungry child, the performer who had learned that laughter was power, all rolled into one figure that the whole world could recognize. And the world did recognize him. In 1915 and 1916, Charlie Chaplin became the most famous man in the world. People lined up outside theaters to see his films. His face was printed on posters, on clocks, on cups, on toys. He was a phenomenon unlike anything cinema had ever seen. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened next. In 1919, Charlie Chaplin did something that would have been unthinkable for a young actor. He formed his own film company. In Hollywood in 1919, the establishment, the group of powerful people who controlled the industry, had all the power. Studios owned theaters, owned actors, owned everything. But Chaplin, along with several other stars, created United Artists, a company that allowed actors to own their own work and control their own creative destinies. This was revolutionary. A poor boy from London telling the most powerful people in the industry that he would not be controlled. Think about that. With United Artists, Charlie Chaplin became not just an actor, but a filmmaker, a writer, a director. He put the Tramp into increasingly sophisticated stories with social messages, with emotional depth, with visual beauty that no one had seen before in cinema. In 1921, he released The Kid, a film that told the story of a man who finds an abandoned baby and raises him as his own. The film was funny, heartbreaking, and wildly successful. But the world was changing. The era of silent films was approaching its end. In 1927, The Jazz Singer became the first feature film with synchronized dialogue. and suddenly the future of cinema looked very different. Charlie Chaplin refused to adapt immediately. He believed, perhaps rightly, that his art was in movement, in gesture, in the universal language of the body, rather than the specific sounds of words. City Lights in 1931 was considered by many to be his finest work. Modern Times in 1936 showed the Tramp struggling against machines, against unemployment, against the crushing forces of modern industrial society. These films were triumphs. But they were also endings. And then came the cost. Every great story has one, and Charlie Chaplin's story has several. His personal life was marked by tragedy and controversy. He married 4 times, and his relationships were often turbulent. His first wife was just 19 when they married in 1918. His second wife was also very young, and their relationship was unhappy from the start. His third wife, Paulette Goddard, was a capable actress who understood his need for creative control. But even that marriage ended in divorce, and his fourth wife, Ona O'Neill, was only 18 when they married in 1943, while Chaplin himself was 54. That marriage sparked enormous public controversy. American society in the 1940s did not approve of such age differences, but it was Chaplin's political views that would destroy his American career. Throughout his life, he had held left-wing political beliefs. He believed in social justice, in workers' rights, in the responsibility of the wealthy to care for the poor. In the 1930s and 1940s, these beliefs made him a target. He was accused of being a communist, of spreading dangerous ideas, of being un-American. In 1952, when Chaplin traveled to Europe for a film premiere, the United States government revoked his re-entry visa. He was not allowed to return to the country he had called home for nearly 40 years. He was exiled, in effect, for his political beliefs. Can you imagine that? A man who had given joy to millions of people, whose films had made the world laugh and cry, was told that he was not welcome in the country where he had built his career. The American government had decided that his art, his ideas, his very presence was a threat to their way of life. Chaplin was devastated but defiant. He moved his family to Switzerland, where he would live for the rest of his life, and he continued making films. But he never returned to America, and he never stopped believing that what had happened to him was wrong. The irony is almost too heavy to hold. Charlie Chaplin, who had spent his career making films that showed the humanity of the common person, who had portrayed workers and the poor with dignity and compassion, was punished by a government that claimed to protect the people. His crime was not anything he did, but what he thought. But here is what I want you to hold onto as you listen. The world did not stop turning for Charlie Chaplin. Even in exile, even when his greatest achievement seemed to have been ripped away from him, he kept creating. In Switzerland, he built a home, raised his children, continued making films. His final masterpiece, Limelight, was released in 1952 and won an Academy Award, but Chaplin could not attend the ceremony in person because of his exile. Even in victory, the shadow of his punishment followed him. And yet, even now, all these years after his death in 1977, Charlie Chaplin's characters live on. His films are still watched, still studied, still loved. The Tramp walks his funny walk across a screen that he never knew would grow so vast, into countries he never visited, for audiences who were not yet born when he last performed. That little figure with the toothbrush mustache has become immortal. Not because the world was kind to him, but because he refused to give up, even when the world was cruel. Now, I want to talk to you for a moment about your own journey, because I think there is something here for all of us. Think about what Charlie Chaplin went through. He was born into nothing. He was hungry, cold, alone. He watched his mother humiliated in front of an audience. He was sent to an orphanage, to workhouses, to stages where people saw him as nothing but cheap entertainment. And yet he kept going. He kept learning. He kept believing that one day, things would be different. Maybe sometimes English feels like that cold room where you were born. Maybe the words do not come easily, and you feel like giving up. Maybe you have been learning for months or years, and it still feels like you are standing at the bottom of a mountain with no path to the top. I want you to know that I see you. I know how hard this is. And I want you to know that what you are doing right now, sitting here listening, learning, trying, is exactly what Charlie Chaplin did in that orphanage. You are building something that will last. You are creating yourself, one word at a time, one story at a time. Every word you understand is like light in darkness. Every sentence you hear and comprehend is a small victory that the boy from Walworth would recognize and celebrate. You are not alone in this. There are millions of people around the world who are doing exactly what you are doing, struggling in the same way, hoping in the same way. And one day, you will look back and see how far you have come, just like Charlie Chaplin looked back and saw the workhouse, the stage, the hungry years, and realized that he had become something extraordinary. So keep listening, keep learning, keep going. Your story is still being written. There are many more journeys waiting here, and I am so glad that you will be here for them. This is Talewise English.